Europe is often introduced as a restless place, born from tribes in conflict, sharpened by war, and lifted slowly from survival into civilization. That story feels solid because it is repeated, not because it is complete. Long before names were written and borders imagined, the land already carried quiet order. Settlements appeared where water, soil, and sky aligned. People moved with seasons instead of against them. Life followed rhythms that did not rush toward conquest or collapse. This earlier Europe does not announce itself with battles or crowns. It lingers in patterns that feel deliberate, almost patient, as if complexity arrived softly. To imagine this world requires unlearning speed, noise, and drama, and allowing something slower to take shape, something that feels organized without command, and ancient without being crude. Because it left few written traces, this Europe is rarely shown. Classrooms move past it quickly, museums gesture without explaining, timelines narrow until silence feels normal. What is missing becomes harder to notice than what remains. Yet absence has weight. When symbols repeat across distant regions without recorded instruction, when settlement forms echo one another over centuries, coincidence begins to thin. The past whispers through gaps rather than statements. Instead of monuments celebrating rulers, there are spaces where hierarchy seems unnecessary. Instead of myths announcing dominance, there are routines that suggest continuity. Nothing here asks to be admired. It simply functioned, and because it functioned quietly, it slipped beyond the stories later generations preferred to tell. Those choices shaped memory long after the land itself had already moved on forward. We are not asked to accept a hidden empire or a lost golden age. The invitation is quieter. Notice how little effort is spent explaining beginnings. Notice how Europe seems to wake suddenly, already divided, already restless. Something coherent may have existed before that moment, something without banners or ambition. Its coherence did not depend on domination, so it left no victories to retell. Its knowledge lived in repetition, not instruction. When later histories arrived, this earlier order did not resist. It could not argue for itself in the language that replaced it. Over time, continuity blurred into folklore, and folklore thinned into decoration, leaving behind a past that feels strangely present, yet unnamed. It survives only as an unease when origins feel incomplete, and explanations seem too short here. This is why the story begins without certainty. The ground beneath Europe holds more than ruins. It holds pauses, breaks, and quiet substitutions. Cultures do not always fall. Sometimes they thin, adapt, and dissolve into what follows. The land remembers even when people do not. Paths remain where words vanish. Habits outlast names. The past becomes difficult to separate from the present because it never truly left. By approaching this history through what is missing, the listener is invited to slow down, to feel rather than analyze, to sense that forgetting can be intentional, shaped not by fire or disaster, but by replacement so gradual it feels like progress. And once that feeling settles, curiosity begins to ask why this earlier Europe faded from view within shared memory over time. The question lingers gently, without demand. Why does this version of Europe feel unfamiliar when it should feel foundational? The answer is not yet offered. It waits beyond the edge of awareness, where silence gathers meaning. The story ahead does not hunt ruins or forgotten names. It traces how memory itself can be thinned, redirected, and reshaped. To follow it requires patience and a willingness to notice what history smooths over. As the listener drifts deeper into this older landscape, it becomes clear that disappearance is not always an ending. Sometimes it is the beginning of a longer forgetting, one that hides in plain sight, ready to be noticed once curiosity has been quietly awakened. This sense of absence prepares the way for understanding how knowledge slipped beyond common recall. Long before alphabets settled into ink, meaning already moved freely across the continent. Ideas traveled without sentences. Memory lived inside shapes, rhythms, and repeated forms that could be understood without explanation. Symbols marked entrances, paths, and gatherings, not as decoration, but as shared reference. A spiral carved into stone did not need translation. A pattern woven into cloth did not belong to one place. These forms spoke quietly, crossing valleys and rivers without losing their sense. They did not describe authority or events, They oriented life, reminding people where they stood in relation to land, season, and one another. Daily life unfolded within this silent language. Homes followed proportions that felt familiar, even across distance, arranged to invite light, warmth, and shared space. Villages did not announce centers of command. There were no raised halls declaring importance, no structures separating leaders from others. Instead, dwellings echoed one another with subtle variation, suggesting agreement rather than instruction. Movement through these spaces felt guided but not forced, as though the environment itself carried expectations passed gently from one generation to the next. This shared system did not create perfection. It created balance, and balance allows friction. People still disagreed, struggled, adapted. Yet those tensions rarely hardened into domination, because no single voice claimed permanent authority. Meaning remained distributed. Knowledge lived in repetition rather than decree. Children learned not by instruction manuals, but by watching patterns enacted daily. Over time, this produced continuity without rigid control, a stability flexible enough to absorb change without shattering its core. When traces of this world are found today, they are often dismissed as ornament, coincidence, or unfinished thought. Patterns appear separated by miles and centuries, yet carry the same quiet logic. Modern eyes search for writing, names, commands. When those are absent, significance is downgraded. But meaning does not require letters to exist. It requires agreement. This civilization spoke through forms that assumed understanding rather than demanding attention, and that assumption made it vulnerable to forgetting. There is a quiet contradiction hiding here. Civilizations without kings rarely survive in history books. Without rulers to name or wars to narrate, coherence becomes invisible. Histories favor disruption over stability, change over continuity. What persists gently is often overlooked. In this way, invisibility is not failure, it is structural. The past that relied on symbols rather than proclamations could not defend itself once new systems valued written dominance over lived understanding. This does not mean the civilization vanished instantly. Its symbols continued, stripped of context, reused without memory. Patterns remained while purpose faded. Over generations, what once communicated meaning became habit, then background. The land still carried order, but no longer explained it. By the time writing arrived to fix stories in place, the earlier language had already dissolved into familiarity, leaving little for records to recognize. To understand why symbols alone could not protect this memory, the story must now move toward power. Words do not simply record, they organize. Writing changes what survives by deciding what matters. When authority learned to speak in names and laws, older systems fell quiet not because they were erased, but because they were never asked to speak again. This quiet displacement prepares the ground for the next question, one that cannot be avoided much longer. How power reshapes memory itself, deciding not only what is remembered, but what is allowed to survive inside the story we call history, after that moment fully arrives. At some point, the rhythm changed. Not abruptly, not with noise or warning, but with a subtle loosening that was easy to miss while it was happening. Life continued, yet something stopped flowing forward. The habits that once carried meaning across generations began to thin. Patterns still appeared, but fewer hands knew why. What had felt instinctive slowly became optional, then unfamiliar. The shift did not arrive with fire or conquest. It arrived quietly, through small changes that felt practical, even harmless, until continuity itself began to unravel. Across the landscape, traces of interruption appear again and again. Settlements that had endured for centuries were left behind without signs of struggle. No walls breached, no weapons scattered, no mass graves to explain abandonment. Traditions that once repeated with precision simply ended, not replaced by something new, but followed by absence. Symbols stopped mid-sequence, as if a sentence had been interrupted and never resumed. The silence is what unsettles most. Destruction usually leaves noise. Here, there is restraint, a sense that nothing went wrong in the way history expects, yet something clearly did. The people did not disappear overnight. Communities shifted, adapted, absorbed new habits. What changed was not survival, but direction. Older rhythms faded as different assumptions settled in. Land that had once been shared gradually became defined. Spaces that once guided movement began to restrict it. These changes did not feel like loss at first. They felt like adjustment. Each generation inherited slightly less context than the one before. Not enough to notice what was missing, only enough to continue living without asking certain questions. This is where the discomfort settles in. Civilizations are supposed to fall loudly. We are taught to look for collapse, invasion, or disaster. When those signs are absent, we assume continuity. But continuity can fail without breaking. It can be overwritten, one habit at a time, until what remains no longer recognizes what came before. The older system did not resist this shift. It had no framework for opposition. Its knowledge was embedded in repetition, not defense. Once repetition stopped, knowledge dissolved naturally, like mist in warming air. Over time, memory detached from practice. People continued to live on the same land, but no longer within the same understanding of it. The ground did not change, but relationships to it did. What had once been guided by shared meaning became guided by convenience, necessity, or emerging authority. This transition left behind no clear villain and no single moment to point to. That absence makes it harder to accept, yet more difficult to dismiss. The unsettling realization forms slowly. Civilizations do not always end when something destroys them. Sometimes they end when something replaces them so gradually that no one feels the need to defend what is being lost. By the time awareness catches up, continuity has already broken, and what remains feels too fragile, too fragmented to be named as a civilization at all. It becomes background, habit, an echo without a source. This is the first true fracture in the story. Not a fall, but a quiet overwrite. What once held together through shared rhythm dissolved into separate movements, each one practical on its own, but disconnected from the whole. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of lives still being lived, just no longer within the same frame of meaning. With that silence established, the question changes. It is no longer about what was lost, but about what was carried forward, and by whom. Because even when continuity breaks, memory does not vanish evenly. Some remember fragments, some forget entirely, and others arrive knowing nothing of what came before. The next chapter begins there, in the uneven ground where remembrance thins, and forgetting quietly takes its place. Order does not always announce itself with commands. In this older Europe, coordination appeared without banners, decrees, or visible leaders directing movement. Villages followed familiar shapes, yet no two were identical. Paths curved naturally between homes, gathering places opened without gates, and work unfolded according to shared expectation rather than instruction. There were no halls raised above the rest to declare authority. No signs of armies preparing for defense or expansion. Life moved with an assurance that feels deliberate, though never imposed. From the outside, such a world seems improbable. Modern thinking associates complexity with control, assuming systems require enforcement to hold together. Yet here, repetition replaced regulation. Homes aligned to light and land in ways that felt intuitive. Shared symbols appeared where guidance was needed, offering orientation instead of orders. These patterns traveled farther than any single leader could, maintained not by oversight, but by agreement inherited through practice. This absence of command unsettles because it contradicts familiar history. We expect someone to be in charge. When no ruler appears, we assume simplicity or disorder. But what if intelligence took another form? What if organization emerged from shared understanding rather than enforcement? This society did not lack structure, it lacked domination. That distinction rarely survives translation into chronicles written by those who ruled differently. Across wide regions, settlements echoed each other, without strict uniformity. The consistency feels intentional, yet flexible, allowing adaptation to local soil, weather, and need. Nothing suggests centralized planning, yet nothing feels random. It is coordination without command, order without hierarchy. The question rises quietly, persistent, and unanswered. How did coherence survive without power enforcing it? The answer is deliberately withheld. The story does not rush to explain because explanation would shrink the mystery. Instead, the listener is asked to sit with discomfort. Order is present, undeniable, yet authority is absent. For a moment, history's loud assumptions fall silent. Complexity no longer proves domination. Stability no longer demands rulers. This reversal is subtle, but it bends perspective. When systems like this disappear, they leave little that later powers can use. No thrones to inherit, no myths to retell as justification. Without leaders, there are no names to preserve. Without wars, no victories to record. The very qualities that allowed this society to function smoothly ensured it would be overlooked once history began favoring conflict, lineage, and command. This is where labels like primitive reveal their weakness. What could not be controlled was downgraded. What could not be commanded was misunderstood. Intelligence that lived in collective behavior left no single figure to credit or blame. As centuries passed, this alternative logic faded from awareness, replaced by systems easier to describe because they concentrated power. The absence of command is not proof of absence of order. It is evidence of a different organizing principle, one that does not survive well once authority begins to document the world. If power was not centralized here, something else must have held life together. That unanswered presence carries the story forward, toward the quiet forces that shaped meaning itself. Those forces were not dramatic. They did not arrive as commands or threats. They lived inside habit, trust, and shared expectation. People knew where to gather, when to rest, how to respond to change without being told. Agreement did not feel negotiated, it felt inherited. Over time, such systems can appear invisible, precisely because they work. Nothing presses attention toward them. Nothing demands defense. They simply continue, until a louder framework arrives and begins to speak over them. At that moment, the old order does not collapse. It becomes background. Understanding this prepares the way to ask what truly bound this civilization together, once command is removed from the center of the story. The mystery is left open intentionally. Coherence existed without domination, and that fact unsettles comfortable timelines. As the story moves forward, attention shifts away from authority entirely. The question is no longer who ruled, but what sustained shared meaning. Only by following that thread can the deeper structure of this forgotten world slowly come into view. It invites patience, curiosity, and a willingness to imagine organization without command, shaping everything that came next. This understanding opens the path ahead quietly. Nothing held this world together through force. What bound it was meaning, shared so thoroughly it did not need defense. Rituals marked transitions rather than demanding obedience. Seasonal movements shaped work, rest, and gathering without punishment or reward. These patterns were not ceremonies performed for authority. They were reminders woven into ordinary life, returning often enough to feel natural. Children learned them without lessons. Adults carried them without conscious effort. Over time, agreement became environment. It surrounded people like weather, present without instruction, trusted without question. This was infrastructure without stone, law without decree, order maintained by familiarity rather than fear. In this world, meaning replaced command as the organizing force. Symbols repeated, not because anyone enforced them, but because they worked. A gesture signaled welcome, a form marked belonging. A cycle announced when to begin and when to pause. None required explanation, because explanation assumes doubt. Shared understanding moved quietly between generations, carried by practice rather than instruction. Where later societies relied on rules to compel behavior, this one relied on alignment. People did not follow because they were told. They followed because the pattern fit, and fitting felt easier than resisting. This slow cohesion created resilience without rigidity. Because meaning was distributed, it could flex without breaking. Change arrived gradually, absorbed into the rhythm, rather than fought. There was no center to overthrow, no authority whose removal would collapse the whole. Stability emerged from participation, not compliance. Yet this strength carried a weakness. What cannot be seized cannot be inherited by conquerors. What lives in habit leaves no treasure to claim. When power-based civilizations arrived, they found little to adopt and much they could not recognize. This is where fragility enters, not through failure, but through invisibility. Systems built on shared meaning do not advertise themselves. They leave no monuments declaring success. When overwritten, they resist being documented because documentation was never their aim. Later, histories mistook this quietness for absence. They looked for laws and found customs. They searched for myths and found routine. In a world that records power, a society that functioned without domination appeared empty, even though it had been full. The most unsettling realization emerges here. This model did not disappear because it failed, it disappeared because it could not be used by those who followed. Empires require symbols of control. Hierarchies need stories that justify command. A civilization sustained by shared meaning offered neither. Once authority began to impose belief instead of inherit it, older structures thinned naturally. Memory without enforcement faded, understanding without power slipped away. And so, the very qualities that allowed this world to endure for centuries ensured it would not continue once force became the language of history. This is why the past appears silent rather than destroyed. Shared meaning does not survive extraction. It cannot be taken, copied, or commanded into permanence. When belief systems harden into rules, flexibility disappears, but visibility increases. Writing preserves what can be named. Authority protects what serves it. What remains outside those structures becomes fragile in a different way, not because it breaks, but because it leaves nothing behind that new systems recognize as valuable. This realization shifts the question again. Instead of asking how such a civilization could function, we begin asking why it did not continue. The answer does not point toward weakness or naivety. It points toward incompatibility. A world organized by shared understanding cannot survive unchanged inside a system that demands obedience. Once meaning is imposed rather than lived, agreement transforms into rule, and rule requires enforcement. The older model did not resist this change because resistance was outside its logic. It dissolved quietly, leaving behind fragments that still shape behavior but no longer explain themselves. To follow what happened next, attention must turn away from harmony and toward the forces that reshape memory. The next movement of the story steps beyond shared meaning, into the rise of power that records, ranks, and replaces what cannot be controlled. This transition marks the end of balance as the dominant organizing principle. What follows is not immediate collapse, but transformation driven by a different logic. As authority learns to name, classify, and command, older structures fade further into background. The question no longer centers on how people live together, but on who remembered their way of living at all. That question carries the story forward, into the uneven terrain of memory and power. It prepares the listener for a shift that history rarely explains clearly when authority takes stage. History did not refuse this civilization because it was weak. It passed over it because it could not carry it forward. The way history is told depends on shape. Stories require names, beginnings, climaxes, and endings. They move along lines of conflict, resolution, and inheritance. This older Europe offered none of those anchors. It had no founders to credit, no rulers to trace, no battles to dramatize. Without those elements, it did not fit the grammar of historical storytelling, and what does not fit is rarely preserved. This does not require blame. Historians work within structures that already exist. Records follow power because power produces records. Authority names itself, dates itself, and ensures continuity through text. What cannot be named drifts. What does not declare ownership resists classification. This civilization lived inside practice, not proclamation. Its intelligence was distributed, not centralized. When later systems looked backward, they searched for familiar markers and found none that aligned with their methods. Over time, history learned to value disruption over duration. Change became visible, stability became background. The louder a civilization was, the easier it was to remember. Quiet coherence faded behind louder replacements. This is why the absence feels deliberate even when it is structural. History does not record everything that mattered. It records what can be used. What reinforces hierarchy, legitimacy, and progression survives. What resists those ideas softens into obscurity. This creates a subtle illusion. When a civilization does not appear in history, we assume it never existed in meaningful form. Yet this assumption reveals more about history's limits than about the past itself. The story we inherit is not a neutral mirror. It is a framework shaped by what power found valuable to preserve. Within that frame, a society without kings, conquest, or mythic authority appears empty, even when it once held deep coherence. The unsettling realization arrives slowly. This civilization may not be missing. It may be layered beneath later narratives, flattened rather than removed. Its absence is not a gap, but a compression. Traces remain embedded in land use, social instincts, and inherited habits that lack explanation. History moved over it like sediment, not fire. The older layer did not vanish. It was covered. Seen this way, erasure becomes passive. No single moment marks the loss. No decree announces disappearance. Instead, history advances with selective memory, carrying forward what fits its structure and leaving the rest behind. The past is not destroyed, it is filtered. What survives is shaped to serve continuity of power, not continuity of life. What remains most difficult to accept is how ordinary this process feels once it is seen. There is no dramatic villain to confront, no deliberate purge to condemn. The mechanics are subtle, almost gentle. History narrows its lens, and whatever falls outside that frame fades. The silence that follows is mistaken for absence. Generations grow accustomed to the shortened story, and the longer one becomes harder to imagine. This reframing changes the question entirely. Instead of asking why this civilization failed, we ask why history could not absorb it. The answer lies not in weakness, but in incompatibility. A world organized without domination could not be translated into a story built on authority. Once writing, ranking, and conquest became the dominant language, older forms of order became unintelligible within official memory. Change did not arrive as an army. It arrived as motion, slow enough to feel natural. New people stepped onto familiar land without announcing arrival, bringing with them different habits rather than weapons. Generations passed, footsteps overlapping older paths, until presence felt ordinary. No single moment marked beginning or end. Movement itself became the story, steady and unremarkable, shaping the land from within rather than breaking it from without. Existing communities did not disappear when this movement began. They adjusted. Old patterns stretched, then softened, as unfamiliar ideas settled alongside familiar ones. Two ways of understanding life briefly shared the same space. One viewed land as continuity, something to belong within. The other approached it as boundary, resource, possession. Neither side announced itself as superior. The difference unfolded quietly through daily choice. There were no clear lines of conflict. Instead, overlap became erosion. Symbols still appeared, but their meaning loosened. Traditions repeated less precisely, then less often. What once guided behavior collectively became optional, interpreted differently by neighboring groups. The process was subtle enough to feel harmless. Adaptation replaced resistance. Survival continued, while coherence slowly thinned. This is where the idea of invasion begins to lose usefulness. Nothing was taken suddenly. Nothing was burned away. What changed were assumptions carried quietly, generation after generation. Ownership hardened. Authority emerged where coordination once existed. Hierarchy introduced clarity at the cost of flexibility. These changes arrived wrapped in practicality, not threat. They solved problems the older system had never needed to name. To those living through it, nothing seemed to be ending. Life continued, fields worked, families formed. Yet something foundational was slipping out of alignment. The shared background that once made understanding effortless began to fracture into explanation and rule. As meaning shifted, memory struggled to keep pace. Each generation inherited less context, until forgetting felt normal rather than imposed. Replacement does not require destruction when systems cannot recognize one another. The older order did not defend itself because it did not understand what was happening as threat. It adapted, absorbed, and yielded space, assuming continuity would persist. By the time difference hardened into dominance, the framework needed to respond no longer existed. This realization unsettles, because it removes drama. Civilizations are expected to fall loudly. When they do not, history assumes endurance. Yet endurance can hide replacement. What survives may not be what once existed, only what could adjust. The land remains populated, but the culture that shaped it dissolves into fragments. The movement never stops. That is what makes it effective. Footsteps continue where memory fades, each step practical, each choice reasonable. Over time, the older system becomes impossible to locate, not because it vanished, but because it blended into what replaced it. By the time history begins to describe the land again, it describes something already transformed. This is the quiet ending hinted at earlier. No fire, no conquest, no final moment. Only continuous motion that reshaped understanding until continuity itself broke. The story now turns toward what followed this movement, toward the moment when coexistence gave way to dominance. To understand that shift, the assumptions carried by those who arrived must be examined closely. This period is uncomfortable because it offers no clear event to remember. Memory prefers edges and breaks. Here, change slides through the center. People lived through transition without naming it. What was lost felt too gradual to mourn. What was gained felt too practical to question. The overlap ended only when one worldview no longer recognized the other as equal. Seen from a distance, this movement explains why silence follows continuity. What replaced the old did not announce itself as ending, only as improvement. The ground shifted beneath ordinary life, while life itself continued. This prepares the question that follows naturally, not about destruction, but about interaction. When two incompatible ways of ordering reality meet, something always gives. The next step is to see what happens when shared land becomes shared tension. This tension does not yet erupt. It gathers quietly, unnoticed at first. Understanding its nature requires patience, because what comes next is not invasion, but adjustment hardened into control. A process history rarely pauses to explain, without acknowledging its human cost fully. For a time, two understandings of reality occupied the same ground. They did not clash immediately because they did not recognize each other as opposing forces. One way of living had grown from cycles, from return rather than advance. Land was not divided, it was entered, shared, revisited, meaning gathered slowly through repetition, reinforced by familiarity rather than claim. Space belonged to use, not possession. Continuity mattered more than origin, and identity flowed outward through participation rather than inheritance. Alongside this, another way of seeing began to settle. It valued boundaries where none had existed, lineage where continuity once guided belonging. Land became something to define, then to claim. Space hardened into territory, meaning narrowed into ownership, and ownership demanded recognition. This worldview did not arrive violently, it arrived with clarity. It offered structure, permanence, and answers. Where the older system assumed trust, this one required definition. At first, the difference was subtle. Sacred spaces were approached differently, not desecrated, simply reinterpreted. What had once been entered with care was now measured for use. What had been shared without question became inherited through bloodline. Neither side declared conflict, because neither fully understood the other. Misalignment deepened quietly, meaning fractured before communities did. The older system did not respond with resistance. To resist would have required a framework it did not possess. It had no concept of defending land as property, no language for enforcing exclusivity. Opposition itself was foreign. Its logic was based on inclusion through practice, not exclusion through rule. When faced with a worldview that organized reality differently, it adapted instead of confronting. Adaptation felt natural. Yielding space felt temporary. Continuity assumed it would persist. This is the moment where later history misunderstands silence as weakness. The absence of conflict is read as inability rather than incompatibility. But coherence does not always produce defense. A system built on cycles does not rush to preserve itself against linear expansion. It expects return, not replacement. When faced with an order that does not return, but accumulates, the older logic dissolves without ever realizing it is under threat. Gradually, the land itself became translated. Paths turned into borders. Gathering places gained ownership. Memory attached itself to names rather than practices. The old meanings did not shatter. They thinned. People continued to live in familiar places while understanding them differently. Rituals lost context. Symbols remained but stopped instructing. What had once been shared, knowledge became tradition without explanation. This transition did not feel like loss to those inside it. It felt like adjustment. Each generation inherited a slightly altered understanding, not enough to notice fracture, only enough to function. By the time difference hardened into dominance, Resistance no longer made sense. There was nothing clear to resist. The change had already been internalized. The unsettling realization arrives here. The older civilization did not fail to defend itself. It never recognized defense as necessary. Its passivity was not weakness. It was consistency. To fight would have meant abandoning the very principles that held it together. In choosing coherence over confrontation, it preserved its logic, even as that logic became unsustainable within the new order. What follows is not erasure through violence, but through translation. Meaning is redefined. Practices continue under new assumptions. The old world does not end. It becomes unintelligible within the new one. Memory begins to falter, not because people choose to forget, but because the language required to remember no longer fits lived reality. This is how worlds disappear without collapsing. When one cannot recognize the rules of the other, negotiation never occurs. One side adapts until adaptation becomes submission, not by force, but by practicality. The land remains full of people, yet empty of the worldview that once shaped it. With resistance absent, something else begins to fail quietly. Memory, once carried through shared meaning, now relies on explanation and record. As coherence dissolves, remembering becomes harder. What survives does so unevenly, fragmented and fragile. The story now turns toward that fragile inheritance, toward the moment when memory itself begins to slip, unevenly and without announcement, leaving behind traces without context. At a certain point, continuity did not end, it missed a step. Traditions were not forbidden or destroyed, they were simply passed forward incomplete. A gesture lost a story. A ritual kept its movement, but forgot its meaning. What once traveled intact across generations began to arrive slightly altered, then increasingly thin. No one announced this change because nothing obvious felt broken. Life continued, seasons turned, families grew. Yet the thread that had tied one generation to the next loosened quietly, until inheritance became partial without anyone noticing. Shared meaning depends on repetition with understanding. Once understanding fractures, memory loses its anchor. Symbols remain visible, but drift into decoration. Patterns survive, stripped of instruction. Practices persist because they feel familiar, even when their purpose no longer lives inside them. Descendants repeat actions faithfully, unaware that something essential has already slipped away. The civilization does not vanish at this moment. It becomes opaque to itself. This is the most unsettling form of disappearance. There is no violence to point to, no prohibition to blame. Forgetting arrives disguised as normal life. Each generation inherits a quieter version of what came before, not knowing what has been lost, only sensing that something no longer explains itself. The past becomes harder to access, not because it is hidden, but because the language required to understand it no longer exists in daily experience. At first, nothing seems wrong. Traditions feel ancient even when their roots are shallow. Symbols feel important even when their meaning is unclear. Over time, explanation replaces participation. What was once lived becomes talked about. What was once instinctive becomes symbolic. This shift is small, but it is decisive. Memory survives best when it is practiced, not when it is described. Here, the first true reveal settles in. A civilization can end while its people remain alive. Cultural extinction does not require disappearance of bodies or bloodlines. It occurs when continuity breaks, when meaning no longer moves forward intact. People remain on the land, carrying fragments without knowing how they once fit together. The world continues, but something essential has already stopped. From the outside, later observers see continuity and assume stability. They see people, houses, customs, and conclude nothing fundamental changed. What they miss is alignment. Without shared understanding, repetition becomes empty. Habits persist without instruction. Rituals survive without context. The civilization has not collapsed. It has dissolved into misunderstanding. This moment leaves no clear boundary in time. There is no date to mark, no event to commemorate. The break is internal. Memory thins unevenly, surviving in some places, fading entirely in others. Knowledge becomes local, fragmented, and increasingly difficult to connect into a whole. What once unified wide regions now survives only as scattered echoes. The unease comes from realizing how ordinary this process feels. It mirrors how forgetting happens in any life. Not through deliberate rejection, but through interruption, a story not retold. A practice not fully explained, a pause that stretches longer than expected. Over time, the gap becomes permanent. This quiet fracture reshapes inheritance itself. What children receive is not absence, but confusion layered with familiarity. They grow up inside systems that function, yet no longer explain why they exist. Over time, this uncertainty feels natural. Questions fade before forming. The deeper logic disappears first, leaving routines behind. By the time anyone senses loss, the chain of understanding has already thinned beyond repair. Nothing announces this ending, yet everything that follows carries its absence forward into the stories history later chooses to tell. With continuity broken, what remains is vulnerable. Detached from meaning, fragments are easily reinterpreted. Symbols can be reassigned. Practices can be reshaped. The ground is prepared for history to step in, not to preserve what existed, but to rewrite it in forms that fit new assumptions. The next chapter begins there, where later narratives encounter these fragments and reshape them into something else entirely. At some point, remembering stopped being enough. Long before textbooks opened their first pages, something older had already closed. What we call the beginning of history did not arrive to preserve memory, but to replace it with something narrower, something easier to carry forward. Writing appeared as a solution to forgetting, yet it quietly decided what would survive. Only certain lives fit into symbols scratched onto stone. Only certain stories could be flattened into dates, names, and outcomes. Written records do not absorb reality equally. They prefer edges and hierarchies, moments of command and moments of conflict. A ruler can be named, a victory can be counted, a boundary can be marked. But a civilization held together by shared meaning resists being pinned down. It leaves no central figure to follow, no decisive event to highlight. When writing becomes the standard of remembrance, cultures without hierarchy begin to fade, not because they are gone, but because they cannot be translated. This shift feels harmless when it happens. Writing promises continuity, accuracy, permanence. Yet every record is also a choice. To write is to filter. To preserve one version requires letting others dissolve. As soon as memory moves from lived practice into text, it changes shape. The past becomes linear. Complexity is compressed. What cannot be summarized disappears quietly between the lines. The unsettling realization emerges slowly. The moment Europe begins to appear clearly in written history may also be the moment something far older stops being visible. Pre-hierarchical ways of living do not vanish in fire or decree. They are simply no longer legible once records prioritize authority. Writing does not erase them directly. It renders them irrelevant by measuring importance differently. This is not an accusation against those who recorded the past. It is an observation about structure. Writing follows power because power requires continuity. Names ensure inheritance. Dates ensure sequence. Victories ensure legitimacy. What lives outside those needs becomes background noise. Over time, noise fades. Silence grows. The written record expands, while lived memory contracts. Once this transition settles, forgetting accelerates. What was once shared through participation now depends on description. Symbols survive without explanation. Rituals persist without story. Detached from daily meaning, they become artifacts rather than guides. The civilization that relied on them does not disappear suddenly. It becomes unrecognizable, even to its own descendants. Here, the reversal completes itself. Writing, often celebrated as memory's savior, becomes memory's gatekeeper. It decides which pasts are accessible and which sink beneath the surface. What we inherit as history is not everything that happened. It is everything that fit the structure of authority well enough to be carried forward. The beginning of history, then, is not a universal awakening. It is a narrowing. As the written word grows stronger, other forms of knowing grow faint. The land remains layered with older meanings, but official memory turns elsewhere. By the time later generations look back, they see only what writing allowed them to see, and assume the rest never mattered. This realization quietly reshapes everything that came before. The erased civilization did not fail to survive into history. History could not absorb it. Its coherence did not translate into names or conquests. What remained slipped beneath the record, not destroyed, but ignored. With memory filtered through writing, a new landscape of stories emerged, one that favored heroes, gods, and battles. To understand how that void was filled, attention must now turn to myth, where authority learned to speak in symbols powerful enough to replace what had been quietly lost. These myths did not arrive as lies, but as solutions. They explained authority, justified hierarchy, and anchored memory to figures larger than life. Where shared meaning once lived quietly in practice, stories now lived loudly in speech and song. The past became dramatic, directional, filled with origins and destinies. In this transformation, older ways were not argued against. They were simply no longer necessary. The page had replaced the ground as memory's home. What could not be written faded further, until silence felt natural again. Once myth took hold, remembrance followed authority rather than experience, and history gained voice while living memory thinned steadily across generations without return again and again. When memory could no longer carry the past intact, story stepped in to replace it. Across Europe, new narratives began to settle into the land, not gently, but with clarity and force. Gods appeared where shared meaning once guided behavior. Heroes emerged where continuity had required no names. Battles filled the silence left behind by forgotten rhythms. These stories did not arrive randomly. They answered a need created by erasure. Where understanding had thinned, explanation became necessary. Where authority had been absent, it now required justification. Myths did more than entertain. They organized reality. A god's will explained hierarchy as inevitability. A hero's victory transformed dominance into virtue. Lineage became sacred, power inherited, command aligned with cosmic order. These stories anchored new systems firmly, not merely by convincing, but by enchanting. They gave emotional weight to structures that needed loyalty, fear, and reverence to endure. In doing so, they replaced older ways of knowing without openly confronting them. This replacement was subtle. Myths did not argue against the past. They reinterpreted it. Spaces, once understood through participation, were reframed as wild, unclaimed, or dangerous. Practices rooted in shared cycles were renamed primitive. What had been balanced became chaotic. What had been quiet became suspect. Older systems were not erased directly. They were rewritten into cautionary shadows. Through myth, forgetting became virtuous. Difference became inferiority. Importantly, mythology should not be dismissed as deception. These stories were powerful because they worked. They created coherence, where fragmentation threatened stability. They bound groups together through shared origin tales. They explained suffering, justified rule, and made obedience meaningful. In a world where shared meaning no longer moved effortlessly across generations, myth provided structure that could be taught, repeated, and defended. Yet this structure came with cost. Myths narrowed the field of acceptable memory. They centered reality around figures larger than life, leaving little room for systems that required no heroes. The older civilization, which depended on collective alignment rather than individual greatness, found no place within these narratives. It was not honored as an alternative. It was recast as absence, as failure, as a stage before real history began. Here lies the section's quiet revelation. Myths did not merely fill a void, they actively sealed it. Once stories of gods and heroes took hold, other forms of memory lost legitimacy. Knowledge that could not be dramatized faded faster. Meaning that lived in routine rather than spectacle became invisible. The land was now understood through story, not through lived repetition. Memory shifted from practice to belief. This transformation explains why earlier ways of life feel distant, even when they shaped everything beneath later cultures. Myths layered themselves over older patterns like paint over stone. The shape remained, but the surface changed. People walked familiar ground while telling different stories about it. Over time, those stories hardened into identity, while the older understanding beneath them became unreachable. What benefits from this shift becomes clear when viewed slowly. Systems of power thrive when dominance feels destined. Hierarchies endure when they appear chosen by gods rather than created by people. Myth supplies that illusion. It transforms authority into fate and resistance into heresy. In that environment, remembering a world organized without command becomes dangerous, because it suggests that power is optional. The rewriting of meaning did not happen everywhere at once. It moved unevenly, layered differently across regions, but its direction was consistent. Authority gained voice, shared meaning lost ground. What could be spoken loudly survived. What required silence and repetition disappeared from awareness. Memory now belonged to those who controlled the story. Still, myth could never fully erase what came before. It covered, reshaped, and redirected, but it did not remove. Beneath gods and heroes, older patterns persisted quietly, embedded in habits, landscapes, and instincts that refused to vanish completely. Even as myths redefined meaning, traces of the earlier world remained, unnoticed but active. To sense them requires looking beneath the stories we inherited. The next movement of the narrative turns toward those quiet remnants, asking what endured despite rewriting. If myths reshaped memory, then something older must still exist beneath them, waiting not to be revived, but to be recognized as the ground upon which all later stories were built. The land never forgot. Even as memory thinned and stories shifted, the ground continued to carry older arrangements quietly forward. Villages grew where earlier paths had already curved. Fields followed rhythms, shaped long before ownership, hardened into rule. Seasonal gatherings returned year after year, not because anyone remembered their origin, but because they felt right. These patterns survived without explanation, woven into ordinary life so completely they escaped notice. What failed was not continuity itself, but awareness of it. The civilization that once shaped these rhythms did not vanish. It settled into habit, becoming invisible precisely because it worked. Walk through towns and countryside today, and the echoes remain. Streets bend where command never straightened them. Homes still open toward light and shared space rather than fortification. Agricultural calendars cling to cycles older than written law. Celebrations labeled as tradition carry movements far older than their stories admit. People participate without knowing why certain moments feel communal, while others feel private. These instincts are not taught, they are inherited. They belong to a logic older than borders, a way of living that survived by becoming background instead of memory, present without introduction. This realization shifts the story inward. Forgetting did not succeed completely, it only hid its work. What remains beneath modern life is not evidence to examine, but presence to sense. The older civilization lives on in pauses, in unspoken expectations about fairness, rest, and belonging. It surfaces when shared spaces feel natural, when cooperation feels instinctive before instruction appears. These are not ideals preserved deliberately. They are structural echoes, continuing without permission. The unsettling part is proximity. The past is not distant. It is underfoot, shaping movement even now. Because this inheritance is unconscious, it resists recognition. People assume what feels natural must have always been this way. They mistake survival for origin. This is how forgetting completes itself. What persists without explanation becomes invisible, and invisibility feels like absence. Yet beneath daily routine, the earlier logic still organizes behavior quietly. Even now, people gather where the land once invited gathering. They pause where cycles once required pause. They cooperate in ways that predate formal systems. Memory failed, but function endured. This is the quiet twist. The erased civilization never truly disappeared. It dissolved into habit, embedding itself too deeply to be removed. Its survival does not announce itself with ruins or texts. It survives as intuition, as an inherited sense of balance that has no clear source. Living inside this afterimage feels ordinary precisely because it is ancient. People move through patterns formed long before names existed, shaped by choices made when hierarchy was unnecessary. Recognizing this does not demand recovery or revival. It invites awareness. The past does not ask to be restored, it asks to be noticed. Feeling its presence changes how the present is understood. Modern systems begin to look less inevitable. Authority appears more recent. Possibility widens quietly. When continuity is sensed rather than remembered, history feels less complete and more layered. The ground beneath daily life becomes thick with unspoken inheritance. This awareness prepares the next movement of the story. With hidden continuity revealed, attention shifts away from what remains toward why remembering now feels necessary. The question is no longer whether the past survived, but why it is resurfacing at this moment. As the listener remains close to the land, the sense grows that forgetting never fully worked. Something waited patiently, shaped into habit, ready to be seen once conditions allowed awareness to return. When identity is built on a short memory, it feels complete while remaining unfinished. Europe learned to recognize itself through stories that began too late, forming a sense of belonging that rested on foundations already thinned by forgetting. People inherited names, symbols, and traditions that felt ancient enough to trust, yet shallow enough to question quietly. This gap rarely caused alarm. It produced a subtle distance instead, a feeling of standing inside a familiar room whose walls could not be fully seen. Modern identity did not arrive as deception. It arrived as inheritance. Generations learned who they were, from histories that started after the oldest layers had already faded. Traditions were repeated sincerely, even lovingly, without awareness of what had been lost. Seasonal rituals continued because they still worked, not because their origins were known. Customs felt grounding without being explained. This created stability, but it also created blindness. When memory stops early, influence continues without understanding. Across daily life, echoes of something older remain. Ways of gathering feel instinctive. Certain places invite rest, while others invite work. Shared norms emerge without instruction, guiding behavior before rules appear. These tendencies feel natural because they are inherited, not learned. Yet when people search for their source, they find silence. Identity forms around absence, shaped by what remains visible rather than what once held it together. This produces a peculiar tension. Belonging feels strong, but depth feels uncertain. People sense continuity but cannot trace it. Ancestry feels present yet incomplete. Questions about origin emerge softly, often at night, when the mind slows enough to notice discomfort beneath certainty. The culture functions smoothly, but something underneath resists definition. That resistance is not failure. It is the after-effect of partial memory. When forgetting removes understanding, influence does not disappear. It simply becomes harder to recognize. Older ways of seeing persist inside newer frameworks, shaping assumptions about fairness, cooperation, and space. These ideas feel universal rather than inherited. They are defended instinctively, even when their source is unknown. This is how the past survives unnoticed, embedded too deeply to be questioned, yet too distant to be named. The danger of short memory is not loss of identity, but narrowing of it. When people believe their story begins where records begin, imagination shrinks. Alternatives feel unrealistic. Authority appears inevitable. What existed before hierarchy seems irrelevant, even impossible. This strengthens the present, while quietly limiting what can be imagined beyond it. This shortened inheritance shapes emotion as much as knowledge. Pride and uncertainty coexist, producing a confident surface over quiet doubt. People defend identities passionately, while sensing something unresolved beneath the defense. They feel loyalty to traditions whose origins cannot be explained, celebrating forms whose meanings no longer reach full depth. This creates a subtle anxiety, not loud enough to disrupt daily life, yet persistent enough to surface during moments of reflection. The feeling is not grief, because nothing is consciously missing. It is unease without a name, a sense that belonging arrived already edited. When cultures grow from partial memory, they stabilize by repetition rather than understanding. Over time, repetition becomes truth, and questioning feels unnecessary or disruptive. Yet the older influence remains, pressing gently against awareness, reminding individuals that identity is layered, not singular, and that what feels complete may rest upon forgotten ground still shaping every step. Those hidden layers continue shaping decisions, emotions, and expectations, long after their origins vanished from story, record, and explanation entirely. Understanding this discomfort changes the direction of the story. Forgetting is revealed not as emptiness, but as structure. Some forms of power benefit when memory stops early, when continuity is shortened enough to remove comparison. Once the cost of partial memory is felt, the question naturally turns toward who gains from that forgetting, and why certain histories were allowed to fade while others were carefully preserved. Some forms of power never need to justify themselves. They do not argue, persuade, or explain. They simply exist, accepted as the natural shape of things. This acceptance does not come from force alone. It grows from forgetting. When no one remembers a different way of organizing life, authority feels inevitable rather than chosen. Hierarchy settles into the background, unquestioned, like gravity. It becomes easier to live within than to imagine outside. This stability depends less on control than on absence. When older models of cooperation fade from memory, imagination narrows quietly. People stop asking whether power could look different because difference no longer feels realistic. The past supplies the limits of possibility. If authority has always appeared as command, then command becomes synonymous with order. Alternatives feel naive, impractical, or dangerous, not because they are, but because they have no place in remembered experience. Forgetting does this work gently. It does not erase opposition loudly. It removes comparison. Without contrast, dominance does not need defense. Systems grow solid when they are no longer measured against anything else. Over generations, authority becomes inherited expectation rather than imposed structure. People follow not because they are forced, but because no other shape of organization feels believable. This is why erasure rarely announces itself. It does not need to. Limitation becomes natural when memory shortens. What once required enforcement now feels intuitive. Compliance transforms into normality. Power appears less as an external force, and more as the way the world works. In this way, amnesia becomes infrastructure, supporting stability more effectively than punishment ever could. The calm danger lies here. When imagination narrows, the future follows the same paths as the present. Innovation becomes adjustment rather than transformation. Change is permitted only within established forms. Anything outside feels unrealistic, even threatening. This is not because alternatives are impossible, but because they lack memory. Without remembered examples, possibilities fade before they fully form. This process benefits power quietly. Authority that never has to explain itself becomes invisible. Questions dissolve before reaching language. People adapt to constraints without naming them, mistaking endurance for agreement. Over time, stability hardens into identity. Defending the system feels like defending reality itself. Yet this stability is built on absence. It depends on the successful fading of older understandings that once proved life could organize differently. When those memories dissolve, so does the sense that power is optional. Authority becomes destiny rather than design. This is why forgetting is so effective. It removes the need for justification by removing the awareness that justification was ever required. The unsettling realization settles slowly. Erasure does not need force when limitation feels natural. Power thrives when alternatives disappear, not through conquest, but through neglect. Over time, what is forgotten no longer needs to be opposed. It simply becomes unimaginable. Memory, then, is not merely a record of what was. It defines the edges of what can be thought. This explains why systems built on authority fear comparison more than resistance. Opposition can be managed. Memory cannot. Remembered alternatives destabilize inevitability. They reopen imagination. They reintroduce choice. In contrast, forgetting seals systems in place, protecting them from question, by making them feel timeless. By understanding power as a byproduct of amnesia, the story shifts again. Authority appears less as villain and more as consequence. Stability grows where memory thins. This does not excuse dominance, but it explains its persistence. Power that seems natural rarely feels urgent to challenge. Yet forgetting is never perfect. Even in shortened memory, traces remain. Older instincts, quiet habits, and unspoken resistances linger beneath the surface. They do not overthrow authority, but they prevent total erasure. If something endured despite forgetting, then power's grip was never complete. The next movement of the story turns toward those remnants, asking whether anything resisted being fully absorbed into silence, and how those fragments survived when memory itself grew thin. Some things survived because they did not announce themselves. They were too practical to erase, too quiet to challenge power directly. When history overwrote stories and memory thinned, these elements slipped beneath notice, continuing as behavior rather than belief. They lived inside movement, preference, and feeling, carried forward not by explanation but by usefulness. People continued to gather in certain ways. Shared spaces felt natural in some places and strained in others, without clear reason. Seasonal awareness persisted even when its origins were forgotten. Work and rest still followed rhythms older than calendars, guided by light, weather, and return rather than rule. These instincts did not require permission. They endured because they solved everyday needs more gently than imposed systems ever could. Spatial intuition lingered as well. Settlements still favored openness over enclosure. Paths curved where land invited movement, not where command demanded efficiency. The pull toward particular landscapes remained strong. Valleys, rivers, and open ground continued to feel meaningful, even when no story explained why. People felt drawn to certain places without knowing what once happened there. Memory had faded, but orientation persisted. These survivals are often mistaken for nostalgia. They are not longing for a lost past. They are inheritance without language. What endured did so because it worked, not because it was honored. Habits outlast stories when they align with human need. Cooperation survived because it eased survival. Seasonal rest survived because bodies required it. Communal celebration survived because it regulated emotion better than isolation. Grief rituals persisted because they offered structure where words failed. This is the quiet revelation. The erased civilization does not persist in monuments or texts. It persists in responses. How people instinctively gather during crisis. How silence feels appropriate in certain moments. How shared meals still anchor belonging more deeply than declared loyalty. These responses emerge without instruction, shaped by patterns too old to remember consciously. Forgetting removed explanation, not influence. The older world dissolved into reflex. Its intelligence embedded itself so deeply that it became indistinguishable from human nature itself. Later systems built over it, borrowing its effectiveness without acknowledging its source. What power could not eliminate, it absorbed unconsciously. This survival was uneven. Some instincts faded more completely, others adapted into new forms. What remained did so quietly, unremarkable, protected by usefulness. These remnants did not challenge authority openly, but they softened it. They reminded people, without words, that life could be organized around shared presence rather than command. Recognizing this continuity does not require belief. It invites observation. Notice what feels natural before it is justified. Notice which behaviors persist without explanation. These are not accidents. They are traces of a way of living that survived, because it aligned with human rhythms more closely than systems built on control. It is in these small gestures that continuity hides best. A willingness to cooperate before reward is promised. A comfort found in routine rather than command. A shared pause after loss that requires no instruction. These moments reveal inheritance that survived because it remained useful across changing systems. Even when authority reshaped rules, these instincts cushioned life, preventing complete fracture. They formed a quiet resistance without intention, preserving balance where memory failed. Understanding this survival reframes the story. The past is not something buried far away. It moves within ordinary behavior, shaping decisions silently. By sensing these survivals, the listener begins to feel how deeply history lives inside daily life, preparing awareness for the moment when old patterns become newly relevant again in the quiet present night, where forgotten structures gently resurface within shared awareness. With these survivals acknowledged, the story turns again. The past is no longer distant or gone. It is active, shaping reactions in the present moment. The question now becomes why this forgotten story is resurfacing today, and what conditions have made people sensitive enough to feel instincts that were always there, waiting beneath the surface. The present rarely announces its instability with clarity. It reveals itself as atmosphere instead. A sense of acceleration without direction, fragmentation without clear cause, fatigue that lingers even after rest. Systems, once trusted to hold shape, now feel strained, not because they are visibly collapsing, but because they no longer feel anchored. People move through routines that still function, yet something underneath feels misaligned, as if the ground has shifted while the structure remains standing. This unease is difficult to locate. It is not tied to a single crisis or moment. It appears in the quiet spaces between tasks, in the sense that effort increases while meaning thins. Structures that once felt permanent now feel provisional. Rules multiply, yet confidence fades. The world continues to operate, but fewer people believe it knows where it is going. This is not panic. It is exhaustion, spread evenly enough to feel personal rather than collective. In moments like this, attention turns backward instinctively. Not in search of comfort or nostalgia, but because the present no longer explains itself. When inherited systems stop working smoothly, their invisibility breaks. People begin to notice friction where ease once existed. Questions rise without forming clearly. Why does everything feel heavier than it should? Why does progress feel effortful rather than directional? These questions are not asked aloud at first. They surface as restlessness, distraction, and quiet doubt. It is in this atmosphere that forgotten worlds return, not because they are rediscovered through archives or excavation, but because their absence becomes noticeable. When the present loses stability, imagination widens reluctantly. People sense that other ways of living must have existed, if only to explain why this one now feels insufficient. The erased civilization does not reappear as history, it reappears as contrast. This remembrance is not driven by curiosity alone, it emerges from necessity. When the present stops feeling inevitable, memory becomes relevant again. The past offers not answers, but alternatives. It suggests that what exists now is not the only form reality has taken. That suggestion alone is destabilizing and relieving at the same time. The mind, especially at night, grows sensitive to these possibilities. Late hours dissolve urgency. Without constant demand, awareness stretches. People begin to feel how narrow their inherited stories have been. The fatigue they carry no longer feels purely personal. It feels historical, layered, accumulated. Something older presses gently against awareness, not demanding belief, only recognition. This is how the erased civilization returns to attention. Not as a solution, but as a reminder that systems have changed before. That coherence once existed, without the pressures now considered unavoidable. When the present begins to crack, the silence beneath history grows louder. What was once ignored becomes relevant, not because it was better, but because it proves difference was possible. Importantly, this remembrance carries no instructions. It does not say how to live, it only loosens certainty. People begin to imagine that exhaustion may not be a personal failure, but a signal of mismatch. That fragmentation may not be inevitable, but symptomatic of structures stretched beyond their purpose. These thoughts do not arrive as conclusions. They arrive as atmosphere, just like the unease that preceded them. This is the subtle reveal. Remembering forgotten worlds is not an intellectual exercise. It is a response to instability. When the present can no longer support itself effortlessly, memory expands to compensate. What returns is not detail, but possibility. The erased civilization surfaces not as fact to defend, but as perspective to feel. As this awareness settles, the story prepares to move again. If instability opens the door to remembrance, the next question becomes unavoidable. What are people actually searching for when they turn toward forgotten ways of living? Not solutions, but something quieter, a sense of balance, a feeling of alignment. The narrative now shifts toward that search itself, toward what feels missing beneath the noise of the present, and why ancient patterns suddenly feel relevant again in a world that no longer feels stable. The idea of a world without domination does not return as theory, it returns as feeling. For many, it arrives as relief rather than belief, a quiet sense that life might once have moved without constant pressure. This appeal has little to do with proving history right or wrong. It emerges from exhaustion. When power feels heavy and unavoidable, imagining a world organized differently loosens the chest slightly, even if only for a moment. It is important to notice what this longing is not. It is not nostalgia for a golden age, nor desire to escape complexity. It is a response to narrowing possibility. The present often feels locked into fixed shapes of authority, obligation, and speed. When alternatives are hard to imagine, any suggestion that life once followed another logic feels expansive, regardless of whether it can ever be recreated. In this light, the erased civilization matters less as destination than as contrast. It shows that domination was not always central to organization. Balance, rhythm, and shared meaning once carried enough weight to sustain life. That knowledge unsettles modern certainty. It suggests that what feels inevitable now may simply be familiar. Difference alone becomes powerful, even without promise of return. This appeal is emotional before it is rational. People are not searching for proof, but permission to think differently. A pre-hierarchical world represents the possibility that cooperation can precede control, and belonging can exist without dominance. The absence of command feels gentle in imagination because it contrasts with lived tension. That contrast creates space to breathe. It is essential not to mistake this feeling for idealization. No past was free of difficulty. No civilization existed without conflict or limitation. The appeal does not come from perfection, but from alternative arrangement. A different balance of values produces different pressures. Remembering this prevents fantasy while preserving insight. What resonates now is not the past itself, but the reopening of imagination. When people realize that hierarchy is not synonymous with order, new questions appear. Could stability exist without constant enforcement? Could meaning travel without command? These questions feel dangerous to rigid systems, but soothing to exhausted minds. This is the chapter's quiet turning point. Remembering erased civilizations is not about reversal or rebellion. It does not demand abandonment of the present. It simply widens the frame. When imagination expands, inevitability weakens. Power appears less permanent. Choice re-enters the conversation, even if no decisions are made. In that sense, the past matters because it releases the future from narrow limits. It offers no blueprint, only perspective. The listener is not asked to believe, only to feel the shift. Once imagination is reopened, the question changes. Remembering becomes less about what was, and more about what awareness now asks of us. The longing that surfaces here is quiet and patient. It does not rush toward conclusion. It lingers, especially in moments of stillness, suggesting that life once carried weight differently. Not lighter, not easier, but distributed in ways that reduced pressure on any single point. This sense of distribution feels almost foreign now, which is precisely why it attracts attention. When hierarchy dominates imagination, everything funnels upward. Responsibility, blame, authority, and meaning concentrate. The appeal of an earlier world lies in imagining diffusion instead. Many hands carrying weight, many voices shaping direction. This vision does not promise harmony, only relief from suffocation. It opens emotional space without claiming certainty. This feeling spreads quietly because it does not challenge directly. It invites reflection rather than action. People sense that the present might not be wrong, only incomplete. That recognition softens defensiveness. It allows curiosity to return without threat. In that safety, older possibilities gain relevance again. In this way, pre-hierarchical Europe becomes a mirror rather than a memory. It reflects dissatisfaction without prescribing cure. The listener is not led backward, but inward, toward questioning assumptions that once felt fixed. What matters is not accuracy of detail, but permission to imagine difference as real. As imagination opens, something shifts beneath thought. Certainty loosens, and with it, the pressure to defend existing structures. Remembering becomes an emotional event, not an argument. It prepares the mind for gentler questions about responsibility, awareness, and choice. These questions do not demand answers yet. They ask only for space. That space leads naturally forward. Once imagination widens, memory takes on a different role. It no longer seeks reconstruction, but understanding of what remembering now requires. The final movement of this chapter approaches that question slowly, asking what awareness itself demands once other possibilities have been allowed to exist. This prepares the transition ahead, where reflection turns toward responsibility. Not action yet, not solution, but awareness of choice. With imagination reopened, the listener is ready to ask what remembering asks in return and how presence changes when memory allowed to breathe again. Remembering does not ask for belief. It does not require revival, rejection, or return. It does not ask anyone to abandon the present or reshape life in the image of something gone. What it asks for is quieter and harder to resist. Awareness. The kind that changes how things are seen without demanding that anything be undone. In this way, remembrance becomes context rather than correction, widening perception without issuing commands. The erased civilization does not need defenders or followers. It does not need to be proven or restored. Its value lies elsewhere. By understanding that another way of organizing life once existed, the present loosens slightly. Structures that felt absolute become relative. Authority feels newer. Habits feel inherited rather than inevitable. Nothing collapses. Nothing needs to. Perspective expands, and with it, a gentler relationship to what already is. This is where remembering becomes grounding rather than disruptive. It offers no blueprint and issues no judgment. It simply reminds the listener that history is layered, not linear. What exists now rests on choices made under different assumptions. Seeing those assumptions does not undo them, but it changes how tightly they hold. The present remains, but it no longer feels singular. Many fear that remembering will lead to dissatisfaction or unrest. Yet awareness does not demand action. It allows space. A person can live fully inside modern life, while understanding it is not the only form life has taken. That understanding does not weaken identity. It deepens it. Belonging becomes less defensive when it is no longer mistaken for permanence. This balance matters. Remembering without replacing avoids idealization. The past is not elevated as solution. It is acknowledged as difference. Difference alone carries power. It shows that what feels fixed may simply be familiar. That recognition does not instruct change, but it softens rigidity. It makes room for humility, patience, and curiosity to re-enter places once guarded by certainty. The erased civilization is not asked to teach lessons. It offers perspective. It reframes struggle not as failure, but as mismatch. It suggests that exhaustion may arise when systems stretch beyond alignment. These insights do not condemn the present. They contextualize it. Life becomes easier to inhabit when pressure is understood rather than internalized. In this light, history serves a different function. It does not exist to instruct behavior or justify systems. It exists to widen understanding. When awareness grows, choices feel lighter, even if they remain the same. People relate differently to authority, to work, to rest, not because they must, but because they can. Perspective shifts quietly, without ceremony. This is the calm ending of remembrance. Nothing is demanded. No stance is required. The listener is invited to carry awareness gently, like a background light. Daily life continues unchanged on the surface, yet something underneath feels less compressed. The present breathes more easily when it is no longer burdened with exclusivity. Can remembering something lost change how we live without changing who we are? The answer is subtle. It does not transform behavior overnight. It transforms relationship. People become less certain and more attentive, less reactive and more reflective. These changes are small, but they accumulate quietly, reshaping experience from within. By lowering the tempo, the story settles into clarity. Remembering is not about reclaiming control over the past. It is about releasing control over meaning, allowing history to exist as depth rather than directive. In doing so, the present becomes less rigid and more humane. With remembrance reframed as awareness, the path forward opens naturally. The story is ready to move again, not toward belief, but toward observation. Ahead lies a careful examination of traces, reinterpretation, and the fragile boundary between forgetting and denial. The listener enters that space prepared, grounded, and unpressured, carrying only perspective and letting it do the quiet work it always does, slowly reshaping how reality is held rather than how it is forced to change. Some forms of evidence do not arrive loudly. They do not announce discovery or demand belief. They appear as repetition, quiet and persistent, resurfacing in places too distant to explain easily. A settlement curve echoes another hundreds of miles away. A gathering space follows the same logic across generations that never met. Paths bend with similar intent. Homes open toward shared light again and again. None of this proves anything on its own. Yet seen together, the pattern begins to press gently against certainty. Coincidence explains a single resemblance. it can account for two. But repetition scattered across vast landscapes, reappearing through centuries without direct instruction, begins to ask for patience rather than dismissal. These similarities do not insist. They accumulate. Each one seems small, unremarkable. Together, they create an atmosphere of alignment that refuses to settle into randomness. The mind is trained to look for clear causes. When none appear, comfort is found in reducing complexity. Similar shapes become chance. Shared habits become instinct. Order becomes coincidence, repeated often enough to feel intentional. But intuition senses something unresolved here. When the same logic appears where it should not, and persists where it should have drifted, the explanation begins to thin. These patterns are not technical. They require no specialized knowledge to notice. Anyone walking across old ground can feel when spaces open in familiar ways. Anyone observing how people gather can sense when behavior follows inherited rhythm rather than instruction. Cultural tendencies linger where stories do not. Cooperation emerges before rule. Certain pauses feel right without explanation. These are not facts to prove. They are experiences to recognize. Modern frameworks struggle with this kind of evidence. They prefer clarity, boundaries, and cause. Patterns that cannot be neatly categorized are treated as noise. Not because they are untrue, but because they complicate the story. A model that works must simplify. When repetition suggests something broader than accepted timelines allow, it becomes easier to ignore than to integrate. This dismissal rarely feels intentional. It feels practical. Systems built to manage information filter what they cannot process easily. An anomaly becomes footnote. A pattern becomes coincidence. Over time, repetition loses urgency. The mind grows accustomed to its presence and stops asking what holds it together. The unresolved fades into background. Yet repetition carries weight. It persists when explanations change. It returns even after being overlooked. The longer it endures, the harder it becomes to erase completely. Patterns do not argue. They wait. They remain visible to anyone willing to notice without demanding certainty. This is where tension builds quietly. No claim is made, no conclusion forced. The listener is invited to sit with accumulation, to feel how dozens of small alignments resist being reduced to accident. The feeling grows not from assertion, but from patience. Something once coherent may have left its shape behind, even if its story was never written. The discomfort here is important. It signals a gap between what is seen and what is explained. Modern understanding prefers closure. Patterns resist it. They open questions without answering them. That openness feels inconvenient, even unsettling. But it also feels honest. What repeats without explanation suggests continuity without memory. It hints at shared understanding that traveled farther than records allow. These patterns do not demand belief. They ask attention. They challenge the reflex to categorize everything immediately. At what point does coincidence stop being random? The question does not require resolution. It requires time. Time to notice that repetition survives forgetting. That alignment persists beneath changing narratives. That structure can remain even when explanation dissolves. Once patterns are seen, they cannot be unseen. They do not overturn history, but they strain it gently. The listener begins to sense why such repetitions rarely change accepted stories. Not because they lack presence, but because they resist tidy integration. To understand that resistance, the story must now turn toward the systems that decide what counts as knowledge, and why certain patterns are allowed to remain unresolved, lingering quietly beneath certainty. Silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is response. When patterns accumulate without fitting familiar frames, the most common reaction is not confrontation, but quiet dismissal. Academic systems are designed to stabilize understanding. They rely on clarity, lineage, and continuity. These qualities allow knowledge to be organized, taught, and defended. Civilizations that leave rulers, texts, and timelines are easy to place. Those that do not are difficult by design. What cannot be framed cleanly rarely moves to the center of attention. This is not hostility. It is function. Institutions survive by narrowing focus. Without limits, meaning dissolves into endless possibility. Ambiguity threatens structure, and structure protects coherence. When evidence resists neat categorization, it becomes background noise rather than foundation. This filtering does not announce itself. It feels reasonable, even necessary. Information must be manageable to remain useful. Erased civilizations lack the qualities systems depend on. They leave patterns without authors, continuity without names, and influence without records. Such traces cannot be easily cited or summarized. They demand long attention without guaranteeing conclusion. In environments shaped by efficiency and verification, this kind of evidence feels unstable. It cannot be proven false, yet it cannot be comfortably affirmed, so it waits at the edges. This waiting is often mistaken for rejection, yet exclusion does not always imply disbelief. More often, it implies discomfort. Evidence that disrupts established narratives requires restructuring the framework itself. That work is slow and uncertain. Most systems avoid it unless pressure becomes unavoidable. Simplification becomes survival. History, like memory, persists by reducing complexity. It favors what can be ordered into sequence and cause. What resists sequence remains unresolved. Over time, unresolved material loses urgency. It becomes footnote, speculation, or curiosity rather than foundation. The longer it remains peripheral, the easier it is to overlook entirely. This process does not require conspiracy. It operates through selection. What aligns with existing models advances. What complicates them lingers. The result is silence that feels deliberate but emerges organically. Attention settles where meaning feels stable. Unstable evidence waits. Understanding this reframes exclusion gently. It is not that certain traces are ignored because they threaten truth. They are set aside because they threaten structure. Systems, built to preserve knowledge, are cautious with what they include. Ambiguity weakens confidence. Confidence sustains authority. This realization shifts responsibility. Instead of asking why institutions refuse certain ideas, the better question becomes, what conditions would make inclusion possible? Attention must shift. Pressure must build. Old explanations must strain enough that unresolved patterns feel necessary rather than optional. Until then, repetition remains quiet. Patterns persist without acknowledgement. They sit beneath consensus, visible to those willing to look without demanding immediate resolution. They survive precisely because they are not integrated. Noise, in this sense, becomes preservation. Who decides which traces become stories and which remain footnotes forever is not a single authority. It is a process shaped by comfort, clarity, and usefulness. When the cost of ignoring patterns becomes higher than the cost of rethinking history, attention begins to move. Until that moment, silence holds. This understanding prepares the next shift. Evidence does not change narratives by existing alone. It requires readiness. When readiness emerges, what waited at the edges begins to press inward. The story now turns toward that moment, asking what happens when attention finally starts to move, and how long unnoticed patterns reshape history once they are no longer treated as noise. Long before histories change, they tighten. Established stories do not collapse suddenly. They hold, even when their edges begin to fray, because they still feel familiar. People continue to rely on them, not because they explain everything well, but because nothing else feels solid enough to replace them. Certainty survives longer than accuracy when alternatives remain undefined. This is the quiet tension before change. Explanations grow heavier instead of clearer. Each new finding requires an exception. Each inconsistency demands a footnote. The story stretches to accommodate details it was never designed to hold. Complexity accumulates without resolving underlying contradiction. What once felt simple now needs constant clarification, and that effort begins to show. Most listeners sense this strain before they can describe it. Something feels over-explained. Answers arrive tangled with conditions and caveats. Confidence remains, but it must be repeated more often. The narrative still stands, yet it requires reinforcement. Meanwhile, another alignment waits nearby, not fully formed, but persistent. The forgotten civilization does not offer proof or replacement. It offers coherence without credentials. Its appeal lies not in certainty, but in how easily its patterns align with what is observed. Settlement echoes make sense. Shared behaviors feel connected. The story it suggests requires fewer corrections, yet simplicity alone is not enough. Without authority, it cannot step forward to challenge what exists. History does not change because of a single discovery. It changes when effort outweighs comfort. When defending the official explanation requires more energy than admitting uncertainty, attention shifts. This shift is slow, internal, and rarely acknowledged in the moment. People continue repeating the old story while quietly doubting it. Possibility enters not as conviction, but as fatigue. Mystery becomes lighter than explanation. The unanswered feels easier to carry than the overworked answer. At that point, resistance softens. The mind allows questions to exist without resolution. This is not rebellion, it is relief. The strain does not announce itself publicly. It accumulates privately, through conversations that trail off, through textbooks that grow thicker, through explanations that feel longer than necessary. Complexity becomes maintenance. When maintenance dominates, curiosity awakens. This moment is fragile. Old narratives rarely surrender gracefully. They linger, defended by habit and identity. Accepting uncertainty feels like loss, yet when coherence fades, possibility gains weight. The forgotten world, once ignored, now feels strangely relevant, not because it proves itself, but because it simplifies what became overburdened. Here, the reveal settles. Paradigms do not fall when they are disproven. They fade when they exhaust belief. When mystery feels less demanding than certainty, attention moves. The old story begins to strain, not loudly, but persistently. With that strain acknowledged, the story turns inward. The next movement does not examine evidence further, but reaction. Belief, skepticism, and fear surface together when certainty loosens. What people feel matters as much as what they know. To understand why forgotten histories remain difficult to accept, the narrative must now explore the emotions that arise when explanation no longer satisfies, and the silence beneath certainty begins to speak. These emotions do not resolve quickly. They circulate quietly, shaping response more than argument ever could. Discomfort hardens into skepticism or curiosity, depending on how safety is felt. When certainty weakens, fear often rises first, guarding familiar ground. Yet curiosity follows, asking what might exist beyond defended explanations. This internal negotiation determines whether attention closes or opens. The moment is personal before it is historical. Each listener decides whether strain becomes threat or invitation. Only then can forgotten structures re-enter awareness without being forced. The story pauses here, allowing that choice to form naturally, without pressure, without demand, before moving forward. It is a silence that listens back, preparing the ground for deeper reflection in the chapters ahead. Nothing is concluded yet, but something has shifted, and that shift quietly matters to those willing to keep listening longer. Some histories are resisted, not because they are uncertain, but because they feel unsettling. The discomfort does not come from violence or loss. It comes from implication. Certain pasts suggest that what exists now did not have to exist this way, and that suggestion touches something sensitive. It quietly threatens assumptions people lean on every day without realizing it. A civilization without hierarchy, domination, or mythic authority challenges deeply held beliefs about human nature. It suggests that command is not instinct, that control is not inevitable, that order does not require force to survive. These ideas feel destabilizing because they undermine stories people use to explain why the world looks as it does. If such a world once existed, then modern systems are not the natural outcome of human behavior. They are one possible arrangement among others. That realization carries weight. For many, identity is built around progress narratives. The present feels justified because it appears to be the result of necessary struggle. Hardship is explained as price paid for advancement. Authority becomes reasonable because it seems required to manage complexity. When a past emerges that contradicts this logic, it unsettles more than intellect. It unsettles meaning. Resistance forms quietly here, not as argument, but as discomfort. People feel tension before they find reasons. They sense threat before language arrives. This is why some histories feel dangerous without appearing violent. They ask questions that do not attack directly, but dissolve certainty gently. They suggest that current arrangements might be contingent rather than destined. Forgetting, in this sense, can become protective. It shelters identity from destabilization. When a story supports belonging, status, or superiority, alternatives feel risky. Remembering worlds organized differently can feel like pulling a thread that unravels explanation itself. It challenges not only systems, but self-understanding. Who am I if the world I inherited is not inevitable? What does progress mean if other paths once worked? Comfort often hides denial. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet refusal to engage. People do not argue against these histories. They turn away from them. They feel instinctively that engaging would require too much reconsideration. It is easier to dismiss than to restructure understanding. This dismissal feels reasonable because it maintains internal stability. This resistance does not make people dishonest. It makes them human. Minds seek coherence. When coherence is threatened, defenses rise automatically. Comfort becomes shield. Familiar explanations are protected not because they are perfect, but because they are known. The unknown carries risk, even when it offers possibility. The unsettling truth is that fear does not always signal falsehood. Sometimes it signals significance. Stories that change nothing provoke little response. Stories that reframe everything provoke silence, skepticism, or avoidance. The reaction itself becomes information, not about the past, but about what the present depends on. Here the realization settles softly. Denial often wears the shape of comfort. Forgetting can feel like peace. Remembering can feel like disturbance. That emotional response explains why certain pasts remain marginal, even when evidence accumulates. It is not ignorance that resists them. It is self-preservation. Understanding this does not demand confrontation. It invites compassion. People resist not because they fear truth, but because they fear losing ground beneath their identity. A past that shows alternatives threatens the illusion of necessity. It suggests that power, hierarchy, and domination are not expressions of nature, but of choice. That idea carries responsibility. If systems are chosen, they can be examined. If they are examined, they can change. Change, even imagined, introduces uncertainty. Many would rather protect certainty than explore possibility. In that sense, forgetting performs emotional labor. It keeps life predictable. Yet, this protection has cost. When forgetting guards comfort too well, imagination contracts. Possibility narrows. People become defenders of systems they never chose, mistaking inheritance for destiny. The danger is not remembering differently. The danger is never realizing difference existed. As this section closes, the tension remains unresolved. Fear has been named, not judged. It sits beneath skepticism, shaping response quietly. With fear acknowledged, the story is ready to move forward. The next section explores how belief adapts to preserve stability, how skepticism becomes selective, and how minds negotiate between curiosity and protection when the past feels too close for comfort. Skepticism is one of the mind's most valuable tools. It protects against deception, error, and wishful thinking. Doubt keeps ideas from settling too quickly. It asks for clarity, consistency, and restraint. Without it, belief becomes fragile. Yet skepticism has a quiet shadow. When ideas threaten coherence, doubt can slide from questioning into defense without announcing the shift. This transition is easy to miss because it feels responsible. Dismissing a claim can feel safer than holding uncertainty. The mind prefers clean boundaries. When a story unsettles identity or inherited understanding, skepticism can harden into refusal, even while insisting on rationality. The person believes they are protecting truth, when they may also be protecting stability. The difference between questioning and shielding lies not in logic, but in reaction. True skepticism stays curious. It listens even while doubting. Defensive skepticism reacts quickly. It searches for flaws before understanding context. The speed of rejection becomes the clue. When dismissal arrives faster than consideration, doubt may be serving comfort rather than inquiry. This is why the narration invites reflection rather than agreement. Notice what tightens inside you. Which ideas feel tempting to discard immediately? Which possibilities feel unsettling to hold for even a moment? These reactions are not failures of reason. They are signals. They reveal where identity, belief, and coherence intersect. Resistance itself can be informative, not as proof that an idea is true, but as evidence that it matters. Stories that change nothing rarely provoke strong responses. They pass through unnoticed. When a narrative disrupts assumptions, the mind mobilizes, emotion appears, tension rises, attention sharpens. Something important is being touched. This does not mean resistance confirms the past being explored. It means the story has impact. It presses on structures that support everyday certainty. The reaction becomes part of the landscape, revealing where questions feel dangerous. Observing that response with calm curiosity allows skepticism to remain open instead of defensive. Late at night, this distinction becomes clearer. Without urgency, the mind loosens its grip. Doubt can pause without needing resolution. The listener may notice moments of discomfort passing without immediate explanation. This pause is important. It creates space where understanding can form without pressure. Healthy skepticism asks questions and remains present with uncertainty. Defensive skepticism seeks closure quickly, even if that closure is dismissal. One expands awareness, the other contracts it. Recognizing this line does not require changing belief. It requires noticing posture. Posture determines how ideas are met. An open stance allows thoughts to enter and leave without demand. A guarded stance repels before contact. Neither is immoral. Both emerge from need. The key difference lies in awareness. When defense operates unnoticed, it masquerades as reason. The narration does not ask listeners to abandon skepticism. It asks them to observe its movement. Notice when doubt feels calm and exploratory. Notice when it feels urgent or protective. These sensations offer guidance more reliable than argument. They reveal how closely belief is tied to emotional ground. In this way, resistance becomes map rather than obstacle. It shows where stories touch identity, security, and worldview. The map does not tell the listener where to go. It shows where terrain becomes uneven. Walking carefully matters more than arriving quickly. This patience changes the experience of listening. Instead of deciding what to accept or reject, the listener remains with the question. The story becomes something to sit with, not solve. This shift lowers defensiveness and preserves curiosity. When curiosity survives, fear loses urgency. The mind no longer rushes to protect coherence. It allows unfamiliar possibilities to exist without needing immediate conclusion. This does not weaken rationality. It deepens it. The line between skepticism and defense becomes visible only when time is allowed. Rushed judgment hides motive. Slowness reveals it. By pausing, instead of deciding, the listener creates room for insight that argument alone cannot provide. This is where the section settles. No verdict is requested, no stance demanded. The invitation is simply to remain attentive to inner movement. What tightens, what opens, what resists. In that attention, skepticism regains its original purpose, not as shield, but as tool. With internal resistance explored, the story slows further. There is no rush to resolve uncertainty. The next movement invites an even gentler response. What happens when, instead of deciding what to believe, we pause and let the question breathe? That pause becomes the threshold. On one side stands certainty, guarded and familiar. On the other stands openness, undefined but alive. Nothing is forced across it. The listener simply notices the space where choice has not yet been made. In that space, fear softens, curiosity steadies, and awareness deepens quietly, preparing the mind for what comes next without pressure or demand. It is there that reflection replaces reaction, and understanding begins forming naturally, without haste or defense, within awareness itself. Not every story asks to be finished. Some histories resist conclusion, not because they are incomplete, but because closure would reduce them. The erased civilization belongs to this quieter category. It does not demand belief or rejection. It does not insist on proof. It invites something gentler, the ability to remain with uncertainty without discomfort. In a world trained to resolve, this alone is unfamiliar. We are taught to seek answers quickly, to decide what is true, what is false, and what can be ignored. Yet, some questions lose their value when settled too fast. They narrow once named. They flatten once explained. The history explored here functions differently. It opens space rather than closes it. Allowing it to exist as possibility already changes how the present is held. Uncertainty, in this sense, is not failure. It is capacity. It allows imagination to move without direction. When the erased civilization is not forced into belief, it becomes perspective instead of position. The listener is no longer tasked with defending an idea. Awareness can rest, open, attentive. Holding the question open reshapes perception quietly. Certainty softens. Assumptions loosen. The need to protect existing narratives eases, because nothing is being replaced. The present remains intact. Modern life does not collapse under reflection. It simply becomes less absolute. That subtle shift matters more than any conclusion ever could. The mind relaxes when it is not asked to decide. Late at night, especially, questions feel lighter when they are allowed to float. They drift through awareness without pulling it forward. This is where contemplation replaces argument. The story becomes something to feel rather than solve. History grows this way, not through answers but through better questions. Each unanswered inquiry stretches understanding a little wider. It creates room for nuance, patience, and humility. When the past is allowed to remain partially unknown, it resists being used, controlled, or simplified. It stays alive. There is comfort here. Not knowing removes pressure. It frees the listener from needing to agree, defend, or dismiss. The erased civilization can remain unresolved without diminishing its influence. Simply recognizing that such a world may have existed reframes certainty. It introduces depth without instruction. This openness changes relationship to history itself. The past stops being a closed book and becomes a layered presence. It invites ongoing dialogue rather than final judgment. In that dialogue, meaning evolves naturally, without being forced into shape. As this chapter settles, the tone slows, words soften, attention widens. Nothing more needs to be added. The question has done its work by remaining unanswered. Curiosity replaces tension. Awareness replaces debate. The listener is not carried forward by conclusion, but by stillness. The story prepares to move into its final movement, not by accelerating, but by releasing urgency. Reflection deepens when nothing demands response. What if not knowing is the point? Not as excuse, but as invitation. An invitation to stay present with complexity, to accept that some truths operate best when held gently, to allow perspective to shift without direction. With the question left open, the narrative can now move beyond explanation entirely. What follows is not more argument or evidence, but reflection and silence. Chapters 9 and 10 do not answer what has been raised. They settle into it. They let the weight of possibility remain without naming it. The erased civilization fades back into the background from which it came, not lost, not confirmed, simply present as depth. The listener carries forward not knowledge, but spaciousness. In that space, understanding continues quietly, without words, preparing the ground for the final descent into stillness, where meaning no longer needs to speak to be felt. The past does not arrive announcing itself. It rarely appears as memory or story. More often, it lives as structure, shaping movement without explanation. The erased civilization, long absent from records, did not retreat into distance. It settled into normalcy. Its influence became so complete that it no longer needed to be named. What survived did not survive as history. It survived as habit. Look closely at how people move through space. Notice where gatherings form naturally, where conversations linger, where silence feels appropriate. These patterns do not emerge randomly. They echo arrangements older than written instruction. Open spaces invite shared presence. Certain paths feel right even when they are inefficient. People rest when light fades, not because a rule demands it, but because bodies expect it. These rhythms feel chosen, yet they arrive already formed. Seasonal movement continues to guide life quietly. Work intensifies, slows, and pauses in ways that align with cycles few can explain fully. Celebrations return at familiar points in the year, carried forward without clear origin. These moments feel grounding, not because they are remembered, but because they are inherited. They regulate emotion and expectation without conscious effort. What once required shared meaning now survives as instinct. Social behavior reveals the same continuity. Cooperation often precedes instruction. Shared meals still anchor belonging more deeply than formal agreement. During moments of loss, people gather before being asked. Comfort forms around proximity rather than hierarchy. These responses feel human, not historical. Yet they reflect patterns that once structured entire ways of living, long before authority formalized them. The subtlety matters. The past does not insist. It does not argue for relevance. It organizes quietly, shaping what feels natural. When something feels obvious, it escapes attention. People assume these behaviors arise from human nature alone, unaware that nature itself was shaped by long practice. The erased civilization did not vanish because it failed. It vanished because it succeeded too well at aligning with human rhythm. This is the quiet reveal. The more complete the erasure, the more seamless the integration. What blended into everyday life no longer needed memory. It became background, supporting modern systems without challenging them. Authority layered itself on top of older patterns, borrowing their effectiveness without acknowledging their source. Life continued to work because it rested on foundations laid before command. Recognizing this does not feel like discovery. It feels like recognition. A moment when something familiar gains depth. The present begins to look layered rather than isolated. What once felt instinctive now carries history without narrative. This realization does not disrupt daily life. It enriches perception. The erased civilization does not return as identity. It does not demand allegiance or revival. It remains embedded, shaping response rather than belief. People feel drawn to certain landscapes without knowing why. They feel comforted by rhythms they cannot trace. These sensations are not imagined, they are lived. Because this influence operates unconsciously, it remains unseen. The mind searches for causes in the visible present. It rarely looks beneath normalcy. What functions smoothly escapes analysis. This is why the past feels absent even when it remains active. Forgetting was never total. It simply relocated meaning from awareness into behavior. As the listener senses this continuity, the distance between past and present collapses quietly. History no longer feels separate. It feels present without voice. This prepares a deeper question. If the past still organizes life so thoroughly, why is it so difficult to see? What keeps influence hidden, even as it shapes everything around us? The story now turns toward perception itself. Understanding how something can be everywhere yet unnoticed requires examining familiarity. When influence becomes environment, it disappears from focus. The next movement explores why the most powerful inheritances are often invisible, and how the ordinary becomes the most effective hiding place for what history never fully erased. The strongest influences are rarely the ones we see. They do not announce themselves because they do not need to. What feels ordinary slips past attention, protected by familiarity. The mind is drawn toward disruption, difference, and conflict. It questions what resists expectation. What aligns smoothly with daily life becomes invisible, not because it lacks power, but because it requires no explanation. Human perception is shaped by usefulness. What works quietly is trusted without inspection. When behavior feels natural, it stops being examined. Culture hides best this way. The more completely something blends into instinct, the less likely it is to be remembered as learned. It begins to feel as though it has always been there. This is how older patterns survived. Not through preservation, but through alignment. The erased civilization did not endure by resisting change. It endured by becoming indistinguishable from necessity. Its rhythms matched the body's needs. Its spatial logic felt intuitive rather than imposed. Its social instincts softened daily life, rather than organizing it loudly. Because these patterns solved problems gently, they required no defense. They continued without memory. Invisibility here is not loss, it is success. What needed no explanation survived longest. Forgetting was not an accident. It was the natural outcome of seamless integration. Once meaning is assumed, it no longer needs story. Memory fades, but influence remains active. This challenges the idea that erasure must be violent or total. Total erasure was never necessary. Forgetting was enough. When something becomes background, it no longer competes for attention. It shapes behavior silently. Over time, people stop asking where it came from. Origin disappears beneath function. Consider how rarely daily habits are questioned. People gather, pause, celebrate, and grieve in familiar ways without examining why those forms feel appropriate. These responses appear personal or cultural, yet their consistency across generations reveals inheritance. Because they feel obvious, they escape scrutiny. Obviousness becomes camouflage. The mind prefers stories with beginnings and endings. Instinct resists narrative. It operates without reference. This is why histories focus on events rather than environments. Environments shape behavior continuously, but silently. They leave no clear moment to record. They organize life steadily, without drama. What is dramatic becomes remembered. What is stable disappears from awareness. This explains why the most enduring structures are often unseen. They do not demand loyalty or belief. They ask nothing. They simply work. Over time, they become indistinguishable from human nature itself. People defend them instinctively, without knowing they are inherited. They feel personal even when shared. This realization carries a quiet tension. If much of what shapes life is unnoticed, certainty becomes fragile. People assume they act freely, yet many choices arise from deep patterns set long ago. This is not determinism. It is context. Awareness does not remove influence. It reveals it. The engagement here comes softly. The thought settles without force. What shapes you more, the things you remember, or the things you never question? The answer does not need to be spoken. The feeling is enough. Invisibility also explains resilience. Systems built on command must be reinforced constantly. Systems built on instinct persist effortlessly. When authority weakens, instinct remains. When memory thins, habit survives. This is why older patterns endured despite rewriting. They required no permission. Yet invisibility has consequence. What cannot be seen cannot be protected consciously. What feels natural may no longer feel chosen. People mistake inheritance for inevitability. Over time, this narrows imagination. If behavior feels instinctive, alternatives feel wrong rather than unfamiliar. In this way, success becomes limitation. Still, awareness changes the relationship. Noticing what feels natural does not strip it of value. It adds depth. The ordinary becomes layered. Daily life becomes historical without becoming heavy. Understanding emerges without instruction. As this awareness settles, the story slows again. Nothing needs to be done with this insight. It is enough to hold it gently. Invisibility no longer signals absence. It signals endurance. If forgetting was enough, then memory was never the sole carrier of influence. Behavior was, environment was, rhythm was. This understanding reframes the entire journey so far. The erased civilization did not need recognition to persist. It needed alignment. Now a final question arises naturally. If invisibility is complete, if the past still shapes life without being noticed, does awareness change anything at all? The next movement turns toward that quiet threshold, where recognition meets acceptance, and where seeing does not demand action, only presence. Awareness does not rebuild what has passed. It does not restore lost systems or revive old ways of living. It asks for nothing so demanding. The erased civilization does not return when it is recognized. It remains where it has always been, embedded quietly beneath the present. The value of noticing it lies elsewhere, in how perception shifts, rather than how behavior changes. There is a temptation to treat remembering as instruction, to assume that recognition must lead to recovery. Yet nothing here requires correction. Modern life does not need to be undone or repaired. The past is not held up as a solution waiting to be applied. Awareness works differently. It expands context. It loosens the grip of certainty. It allows the present to be seen as one expression among many, not as the inevitable end of all previous movement. This expansion creates humility rather than longing. Nostalgia pulls backward, idealizing what can never return. Awareness moves outward, creating space around what already exists. Knowing that alternatives once shaped life does not demand their revival. It reminds the listener that current arrangements are not synonymous with reality itself. They are choices made within particular conditions, layered over older foundations. Such recognition does not destabilize daily life. It softens it. The present feels less absolute, less defended. Authority becomes contextual rather than natural. Habits feel inherited rather than unquestionable. This shift is quiet but significant. It changes relationship, not structure. People continue living as they were, yet with a subtle sense of depth beneath routine. This kind of awareness resists urgency. It does not hurry toward outcome or reform. It settles. The listener is not asked to believe differently or act differently. They are asked only to see more clearly. In doing so, pressure eases. Certainty loosens without collapse. Identity becomes layered rather than threatened. The erased civilization matters not because it offers direction, but because it offers perspective. It reveals that life has taken other shapes before and could take other shapes again, without insisting that it should. That possibility alone changes how the present is held. It becomes lighter, less defensive, less constrained by imagined necessity. Can something matter deeply even if it changes nothing directly? The answer lives here. Awareness alters experience without altering form. It changes tone rather than outcome. The listener may notice patience where there was urgency, curiosity where there was rigidity. These shifts are internal, cumulative, and gentle. As action is released, the story quiets further. There is nothing left to pursue, no conclusion to reach. The journey has done what it needed to do by opening perception and then letting go. The erased civilization fades again, not into forgetting, but into background, where it has always lived. This prepares the final movement. With effort removed, the narrative moves toward stillness. Reflection replaces explanation. Silence becomes meaningful rather than empty. The listener is invited not to decide or interpret, but to rest within widened awareness. The end does not arrive as resolution. It arrives as release. What remains is presence, unpressured and attentive. History no longer asks to be mastered or explained. It settles into perspective, carrying weight without demand. With action released, the story steps back. What follows is not further argument, but quiet convergence. The final chapter does not add knowledge. It removes the need for it. Everything that mattered has already been felt. Silence now holds what words no longer need to say. There comes a moment in every long story when explanation begins to lose its power. Not because it fails, but because it has done all it can. Words reach their limit. Interpretation circles back on itself. The desire to define gives way to the need to pause. This is not an ending. It is a widening, where meaning no longer moves forward through answers, but settles into space. History reaches this point quietly. After layers of detail, argument, and interpretation, something softens. The erased civilization no longer asks to be examined. It no longer requires defense or proof. It is allowed to exist as absence, carrying weight without description. The effort to explain releases, and in that release, something else becomes present. Uncertainty here is not lack. It is presence. It holds attention gently, without demanding resolution. The listener is invited to remain inside this space, where questions breathe without urgency. The past does not recede. It rests. Its influence is no longer traced or analyzed. It is felt, like a depth beneath still water, unseen yet undeniable. Explanation has a certain motion. It pushes forward, seeking clarity, closing distance between knowing and not knowing. When that motion stops, stillness appears. This stillness is not empty. It carries everything that explanation could not resolve without flattening. It preserves complexity by refusing to reduce it. The erased civilization becomes something different here. Not object of study, not theory, not argument. It becomes atmosphere, a quiet presence shaped by what is no longer spoken. The need to name it dissolves. It remains without label, and that unlabeled existence feels right. Meaning does not always arrive through answers. Sometimes it arrives through release. When explanation steps aside, awareness expands naturally. The listener no longer asks what to believe. They notice what feels settled. The story completes its work by stopping. This pause does not remove history. It deepens it. History becomes less about instruction and more about perspective. It reminds rather than directs. In this space, the past is not something to master. It is something to sit with. Late at night, this feels familiar. The mind loosens its grip on resolution. Thoughts slow. Certainty softens. What remains feels larger than any single idea. The erased civilization rests here comfortably, no longer needing to be held up or taken apart. This is where understanding lets go, not because it gives up, but because it recognizes completion. The effort to extract meaning gives way to the experience of it. The listener feels not informed, but aligned, not convinced, but calm. What remains when understanding lets go is space, a space where complexity can exist without conflict, where the past and present overlap without explanation, where influence is felt without analysis. This space does not demand agreement. It offers quiet companionship. In stepping back from explanation, the narrative honors the limits of language. Words cannot carry everything. Some things endure better when left unnamed. The erased civilization, once hidden by silence, now returns to silence by choice. A different silence, one that holds rather than erases. The story now moves inward. Reflection replaces interpretation. Attention turns from what was uncovered to what is felt. The listener is not asked to remember details, only to remain present. From here, the final movement begins, not toward conclusion, but toward stillness. The need to understand dissolves. The need to be right disappears. What remains is enough. The narrative no longer leads. It accompanies. It settles beside the listener, allowing thoughts to drift without direction. The journey that began with curiosity now ends in quiet recognition. Explanation has stopped. Meaning has not. A world does not have to announce itself to endure. Some ways of living are not built to leave monuments or names. They move through time quietly, passing on what is needed and letting the rest dissolve. In this sense, forgetting is not always loss. It can be completion. The erased civilization may never have expected permanence. Its continuity did not depend on being remembered, recorded, or admired. Imagine a culture that does not measure success by endurance of symbols, but by how smoothly life continues after it fades. Practices are shaped to function, not to be celebrated. Knowledge travels through habit, not proclamation. Once it has done its work, it does not insist on staying visible. It dissolves into what follows, trusting alignment rather than recognition. Nothing is preserved for proof. Nothing is defended for legacy. Modern thinking struggles with this idea. We assume significance must be marked and survival must be documented. To exist without record feels like failure. Yet that assumption belongs to later systems that equated permanence with value. For a civilization built on shared rhythm, rather than authority, disappearance may have felt natural. When continuity lived in behavior, not story, memory was optional. Seen this way, erasure changes shape. It stops being tragedy and becomes alignment. The civilization passed on what mattered most, then released control. What endured did so because it was useful, not because it was named. Function outlived fame. Influence continued without signature. The land retained its order even when explanation vanished. This reframing carries quiet power. It loosens the grip of modern anxiety around legacy. The need to be remembered may be a later invention, born from systems that feared loss of control. Earlier worlds may not have shared that fear. They may have trusted that what worked would remain without protection. If this is true, then forgetting was not failure but success. The civilization completed its purpose by embedding itself fully into life. Recognition became unnecessary. Nothing had to be defended or restored. The future could proceed without burden of memory. This does not romanticize the past. It contextualizes it. Some worlds are not meant to last as stories. They are meant to pass on quietly, leaving behind coherence rather than record. In accepting this, the listener releases the impulse to recover or correct what was lost. The story reaches a point of release here. Remembrance is no longer required. Understanding no longer presses forward. The civilization rests, complete, without demand. What remains is gratitude rather than grief, presence rather than pursuit. With remembrance redefined, the narrative loosens its hold. Nothing more needs to be carried. The final movement does not explain or persuade. It lets go, allowing the story to settle into silence, where meaning continues without words. The silence that follows is not empty. It carries the sense of something finished without conclusion, whole without outline. In that silence, the listener does not feel abandoned by history, but accompanied by it. The past no longer asks to be recovered or defended. It simply exists as depth, informing the present without instruction. The absence becomes gentle, like a landscape known well enough to walk without looking down. There is relief in this letting go. When the need to remember fades, attention shifts toward presence. Life feels less obligated to justify itself through history, and more free to unfold as experience. Meaning stops pressing forward and begins to circulate quietly through awareness. Nothing has to be proven for it to be felt. This openness invites patience. It allows contradictions to rest beside one another without conflict. The erased civilization does not compete with modern life. It supports it quietly, asking for nothing in return. The idea that something can be complete without recognition loosens the fear of forgetting. It suggests that value is not lost when memory fades, only transformed. In this understanding, the listener is free to stop seeking resolution. Curiosity remains, but urgency dissolves. The story no longer leads anywhere. It rests. Awareness widens, unpressured by direction or demand. History becomes atmosphere rather than argument, presence rather than lesson. The world feels quieter, not emptier. This quiet does not erase meaning. It protects it from being forced into shape. In allowing the past to pass on without name, the present gains space to breathe. What mattered has already done its work. Nothing else is required. The story releases itself naturally, settling into stillness, where understanding no longer needs explanation, and where the listener remains present, attentive, calm. The story does not end where attention stops. It continues without needing to be followed. Time widens here, pulling away from names, borders, and memory itself. Europe dissolves into land. Civilization dissolves into motion. Humanity becomes one presence among many, carried forward by rhythms that do not belong to any single age. Nothing pauses to mark this transition. It happens because movement is natural, and continuity does not require witnesses. The erased civilization fades without ceremony. It does not disappear into darkness or failure. It spreads into everything that followed, losing its edges until it can no longer be separated from the flow of time itself. Its presence becomes indistinguishable from change. Fields turn, rivers move, generations rise and pass. Nothing stands still long enough to be claimed as permanent. What mattered has already moved onward, shaping what came next in ways that cannot be traced cleanly. From this distance, judgment loses meaning. There is no tally of success or loss, no record of endurance weighed against disappearance. Civilizations do not compete with time, they move within it. Some leave names, others leave alignment. Both fade eventually into continuity. Nothing argues with this movement, nothing resists it for long. When the human scale loosens, urgency dissolves. The need to decide, explain, or conclude slips away. History becomes less a story of events and more a pattern of motion, repeating and transforming without instruction. What was once framed as beginning or end reveals itself as transition. Each era inherits something and releases something else, often without noticing. The erased civilization completes itself here, not as memory recovered, but as influence fulfilled. It does not need to be remembered to matter. It does not require recognition to continue shaping life. Its work has already been done. What followed carried it forward unconsciously, embedding its balance into new forms. The thread never broke. It only thinned enough to disappear from view. This realization brings calm. The past no longer feels fragile. It no longer needs protection. It has already passed on what it needed to give. Time did not erase it. Time absorbed it. That absorption is not loss. It is how continuity works when nothing insists on permanence. The story ends without resolution because resolution would be artificial. There is no final answer waiting beyond this point. There is only movement continuing, shaping futures that will one day feel just as inevitable as the present does now. Those futures will carry echoes they cannot name, just as this one does. In this wide view, nothing is wasted. No way of living is pointless because it ended. Each form contributes to what comes next, even when its name is forgotten. Meaning does not vanish when stories stop being told. It changes shape, becoming environment rather than memory. This is the quiet completion. Not closure, but release. The story no longer belongs to the listener. It no longer needs to be followed. It continues without us, exactly as it always has. What if the most complete ending leaves nothing behind but motion? No monument, no lesson, no demand. Just the ongoing rhythm of life unfolding, indifferent to recognition, carrying everything forward into forms no single moment can fully understand. It does not matter whether anyone notices this movement. Time does not require acknowledgement. It does not wait for understanding or agreement. The same patterns that once organized early lives continue to ripple outward, shaping moments quietly, long after their origins have blurred. People walk paths, guided by decisions they did not make, living inside structures older than language itself. This is neither tragedy nor triumph. It is continuity, moving onward without pause. The present becomes just another layer, resting briefly before passing forward. Awareness may notice, or it may drift away again. Either way, motion continues. Meaning does not demand memory to persist. It travels through use, through alignment, through rhythm, carrying life forward without instruction. In this sense, the ending is not an end, but a return to flow. Everything that needed to happen has already happened. Everything that will happen grows from that movement, unfolding beyond intention. The story no longer seeks an audience. It belongs to time, and time moves on, unrecorded, complete in itself. No voice narrates what comes next. The rhythm carries on, unnoticed and sufficient, holding past, present, and future together without distinction. A single motion stretching beyond concern, beyond memory, beyond explanation. Calm, continuous, and whole, enough to be lived, moment after moment, without demand or end.